So Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. As promised, let's revise task 1, which is graph analysis. So Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Okay, so if you still remember, there are two types of graphs, and they are dynamic graph, the types of graph that has trends and has a period of time, and the static graph, which has no trend. Right, we will look at each one of these graphs one by one. Okay. I think we'll start with dynamic graph. Okay, the structure for task 1 is the same. It should be written in 3 different sections or 3 different paragraphs, which is the introduction, the body, and the conclusion. You can write it in just one paragraph, but to make things easier, arrange them in 3 different paragraphs so that it's easier for us to assess your essay. The analysis should be around 150 words. So let's look at dynamic graph. Okay, so we've discussed the structure just before this. We have the introduction, the body, and the conclusion. So let's look at the introduction first. What do you need to do what do you need to write in the introduction? So before that, before writing a task 1 essay, you have to identify the types of graph first, because it's very important so that you won't be writing something which is wrong. You don't want to be writing a dynamic graph analysis for a static graph. Okay, once you have identified the types of graph, then you can start writing the introduction. So what are needed in the introduction? Okay, 2 elements are needed in the introduction. Okay, how many sentences should there be in the introduction? It depends, right? But the elements that are needed are 2. First, you need to describe the graph, which is the graph description. Okay, so it's better for you to rephrase the topic of the graph to have a better score, which shows your mastery of the language or your fluency of the language. The second element that you need in the dynamic graph in the introduction is the overview. Now, for a dynamic graph, you need to describe the overall trend. Okay, don't just mention which one is the highest or which one is the lowest, because if you mention which one is the highest or the lowest, you might just describe one subject. So we don't want that to happen. Right? You can talk about the highest or the lowest in the analysis, but for the overview, describe the overall trend. So let's look at an example. Okay, so we have here a graph, which is a line graph, and this is a dynamic graph because it happens in a period of time from March 1993 until March 1999. Right. So the topic of the graph is the unemployment rates in the US and Japan between March 1993 and March 1999. So let's look at the example. Okay, let's look at what the graph is about. Okay, I'm giving you some time to look at what the graph is about. Okay, and look at briefly about the trend, and let's look at the example of the essay. Okay, so we have here 2 elements. The first one is, if you still remember just now, is to describe the graph. Right? Start by describing the graph. So if you notice, the first sentence here is the description of the graph. It says here, the graph shows the unemployment rates in the United States and Japan between March 1993 and March 1999. Right, so you have here the description of the graph. Okay, so if you notice, the description of the graph and the topic is quite similar. So what you can do is probably you can change here, instead of United States, you can add in United States of America. Right, so make sure the meaning is still the same. Right, so by having this, it shows that you have a broad knowledge of geography, and then you have changed, or you have to rephrase the topic using your own words. So if you are able to do this, then it will be better for you. Okay, the second thing that is needed is basically if you look back at the introduction, the elements of the introduction is the overview. Okay, the overview, again, it describes the overall trend. Okay, so it says here, generally, it can be seen that the unemployment rate in the United States decreased considerably, while in Japan it increased significantly. Okay, it decreased considerably in US, while in Japan it increased significantly. Okay, so in US it decreased, in Japan it increased. So we look at everything in overall. We don't just look at the highest point or the lowest point of one particular period. Because if you do that, if you just talk about the highest unemployment rates in America or in the US, for example, is 7% in March 1993. So when you do that, you only focus on what happens in March 1993. Right? So we want something that covers the whole period, because that's what you need to do in the overview. And the overview should talk about every subject. If you just talk about US, then you only cover America or US. You neglect Japan. Right? It should cover every subject, and it should cover the whole period. Right? I think you're smart enough to figure out a sentence that can do that. Okay, so I think that's the end of the first part of this tutorial. We will continue again with the second part, which are the body and the conclusion. Okay, Assalamualaikum.